So then why do you need to know chemistry? So if you want to go to pharmacology or medicine, if you absolutely hate chemistry, well, you either have to learn to like it or just tolerate it, where do you know the stuff even if you don't like it, but it's unavoidable. Why is it very important? Well, if you're going to pharmacology, you'll definitely know this acronym or some variant of it, ADME. So what does that stand for? So that stands for absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. So what are these new vocabularies? This is a little advanced. This is more like pharmacology and pharmacokinetics, but if you're really interested in this field, these fields, you have to know these at one point. So why is solubility important and hydrophobic versus hydrophilic? Absorption. So what is absorption? Basically, how does a drug get into the body? So how are you able to get a drug into your body, and how are you able to dissolve it and get it to where it needs? So things like insulin. Insulin is a peptide. It's water soluble. So this is like why you inject insulin and use a water-based solution to dissolve the insulin and inject it into the body. Whereas something like progesterone, which is a steroid, so what we have here is instead of being dissolved in water, you see over here that progesterone is being dissolved in this yellow oil. So this is why it's very important to know absorption and which way or what's the best solution to dissolve a drug in. These are both hormones, but being given as drugs. But whether it's hydrophobic or hydrophilic determines on what you're actually dissolving it in. Now, what's distribution? So like distribution, like when you're distributing like the vaccine, how are you going to get to people? Or if you're like Amazon, I know like I don't get too political on that. But distribution, or just like when you're distributing your mail, how do you get the mail to where it's supposed to go? That's the same thing with pharmacokinetics. How can you where does the chemical go in the body? How do you get to where it's supposed to be or where you want it to be? So if you remember here from last semester, what we're seeing here is the blood-brain barrier. So the interesting about the blood-brain barrier, it has all these astrocytes and all these cells that surround the blood vessels that are, so the blood-brain barrier is everything between the blood and the actual brain neural tissue. So the interesting thing is that you have all these membranes, and it's actually a very hydrophobic region. So things like water-soluble compounds and hormones, they're only need to be able to stay in the blood. But because the surrounding is very hydrophobic, anything that's hydrophilic, all these hydrophilic hormones such as monoamines and peptide hormones, they have a hard time actually getting past this barrier. But if you have a hydrophobic hormone or if a hydrophobic drug, that can actually dissolve in past those hydrophobic plasma membranes and that barrier and get to the brain. Or even things like adipose tissue. So the interesting thing is like things like steroid hormones and also like hydrophobic drugs, they all adipose tissue, or if you're new to the class, this is what we call fat. So if you have all this hydrophobic fat and you have all these hydrophobic drugs and hormones, often white adipose tissue, which has a lot of fat, tends to accumulate a lot of these hormones and drugs that are hydrophobic. So it's very interesting. And it's interesting when you lose fat. Sometimes this can cause, if you lose fat and if you metabolize your fat stores, this can also release these hormones and drugs back into the body. But that's a little advanced topic. Metabolism. So metabolism is interesting because it's the sum of those. So this is the physiology. When we think metabolism, if you ask someone on the street what metabolism is, especially if they're like a gym rat or gym bro or gym bunny, is that they'll probably say, oh, it's like how fast you burn calories. So they're talking about basal metabolic rate, but in terms of physiology, it's basically all the chemical reactions that happen in your body. So it's just suffering everything that happens chemical-wise in your body. So how is a hormone or drug altered by the body? Well, this is why the structures are important. Remember those peptide hormones? They're made from long chains of amino acids linked by peptides. So metabolism refers to how this is not only made, but also how you break it down. How do you turn off a hormone? Well, one way you can turn off a hormone is to break it down. Now this isn't one of my pictures, it's from another paper. But here we have insulin, it's binding to its receptor. But you have enzymes that can turn off insulin by chopping it up. So you have these enzymes that are basically able to take that long string of amino acids that makes up an insulin molecule and chop it up. And once you chop it up, well, it can't bind to its receptor, it can't cause its insulin effects, therefore it kind of turns it off. And yeah, so what happens? This insulin, which is made from amino acids, ends up being broken down into peptides and other amino acids. Whole cycle starts over again. But something like, this is why it's kind of important to know these general structures. Like, so here we have testosterone. So testosterone, again, a steroid, but this structure is actually really hard to break down by the body. So instead of breaking it down into little carbon atoms, what it does is it actually attaches a hydrophilic compound. So the way your body kind of gets rid of sex hormones and steroid hormones is that it basically attaches something that's hydrophilic to it. Because remember, in its original form, steroid hormones are hydrophobic. So it's going to have a hard time dissolving in your blood, dissolving in your urine. But if you attach something that's hydrophilic, this makes it more water soluble. So this is one major way your body is able to clear hydrophobic compounds. It adds something that's hydrophilic. So now you can wash away this compound in water. Yep, so it helps if you by attaching something that's more hydrophilic. This makes it more able to diffuse and dissolve in water. Now, so the last one is excretion and elimination. So what is the primary carrier of hormones? Blood, right? And then what chemical makes up the most of the volume and mass of blood plasma and interstitial fluid? H2O, right? So water. So the thing is that it's very interesting because like when you have something that's so it's easy to get rid of a hydrophilic compound because why? Easy to transport in your blood, easy to and your urine. What compound makes up most of the volume of your urine? Water, right? So water-soluble compounds, water-soluble hormones, they're easy to eliminate. You can either break it down itself, or you can just void it out. You can just push it out through your urine. But hydrophobic compounds are harder to get rid of. So it's kind of like this. Like when you have the fats, it's trying to. So this is why you have that metabolism for testosterone and other hydrophobic compounds. Like here we have our dirty, like we have this. Or if you've ever done the dishes or cooked something that's very rich and all this grease, can you just run plain water, no detergent, on these dishes and expect it to be completely clean? No, right? You kind of had to add something else to help dissolve it. So in the previous example, we showed like, okay, you have to make it a little more hydrophilic, or you can add things that kind of, detergents are very interesting too. They both have a hydrophobic side and a hydrophilic side. And this is why detergents are able to dissolve these fats and greases and hydrophobic compounds, because they're able to associate with water, but they're also able to associate with the hydrophobic compounds. They're kind of like if you ever had like a friend, or if you are that friend that likes to hang out with two groups that don't like each other, but you're kind of like the floater that sits on the fence. There's this very interesting class of compounds called amphipathic compounds that can associate with both, but detergents are one of those. They can hang out with both crowds, but they're also kind of a bridge to help one crowd dissolve in the other.